Yeah, gotta aim for the top like, hold up. Yeah, I can never doubt myself, I know better. All of you critics be acting like you know better. Blowing the smoke, but I know when the dust settles that I'm in my element. It's evident that there's levels to the game.
What's happening, people? Welcome back to the Athletes to Athletes podcast. In case you didn't know, March is Women's History Month, and March 8th is International Women's Day, as well as my mom's birthday. So happy birthday, Mom. But to celebrate here on the A2A podcast, I figured I would talk with women in the sports industry. And today I got to have a conversation with sports reporter Karisa Maxwell, a Penn State grad that has interviewed some of the baddest fighters on the planet. We talk about how she got into sports media, her favorite interview with Jon Jones, and how she deals with being a woman in a male dominated industry. So I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Karisa. And as always, I appreciate you listening to the Athletes to Athletes podcast. So as I said, today I am sitting down with Karisa Maxwell. And Karisa, it is awesome to have you on the show. Really appreciate you hopping on. And first off, really appreciate you accepting the connection on LinkedIn and answering as quickly as you did. So welcome to the show. Happy to have you.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So as I told you, I always love asking the same first question to everyone. And that question is, why sports, right? Like, you've been in the sports community for quite a long time, a lot of on-camera time, but what was it that kind of drew you into being a sports reporter and maybe not news or politics or something else that's out there?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a huge sports fan, right? I grew up in a very big sports fan family. So I always was interested in sports, but it really wasn't until I got a little bit older, like in high school, where my brother, really good baseball player, he's getting, scholarship offers and getting recruited. And I'm trying to like have a human conversation with him and just like my friends who played sports in general, right? And I'm like, you're more than just an athlete. Like, what else do you like? What are your hobbies? Who are you? Let's try to break this barrier here. And it was kind of fascinating just how difficult, not only with him, but again, with like all of my friends, where they just define themselves by their sport. So I kind of just fell in love with the idea of like, I can try to break these athletes and get to know them and show the more human side of them while also showcasing this incredible athletic ability
Mhm.
that they have. And I mean, to your question about why not politics, why not news, it was never that those weren't options. I mean, even to this day, right? Like, I would love to work in either of those industries, but sports was kind of all encompassing, where you have the sports, you have the X's and O's, but there's the human interest side. There are things that are happening in the world, in politics, in the news, that we're seeing translated onto the field. We're seeing translated into the charities that athletes are starting, or the movements that they're starting, or the things that they stand for. So it was just kind of this all-encompassing industry, really, where you can escape reality by having the sports fandom to focus on, but you could also talk to these people that so many people and kids look up to as role models, and see how they're giving back to their communities and see how they're leaving their lasting impact on the world outside of their field of play. So I just found it to be a very diverse industry to work in, where you can kind of get a little bit of everything.
Mhm. So as I said, we already know what you do now, but before getting into sports reporting, you had to pick a school. You had to figure out where you were going to study sports reporting and become the journalist that you are. What other schools were you looking at? Obviously, you landed on Penn State, but what was it about, also what was it about Penn State that kind of drew you there? But what other schools were you looking at as well?
So I was originally going to school for musical theater, not even sports. Like, journalism was going to be maybe a minor, or something that I knew that I could translate my theater skills to being on camera if need be.
Mhm.
So I was actually committed to Ithaca. I got a full ride scholarship to Ithaca. I was committed to Ithaca, but I still had a tour at Penn State, and I went, and it was in February, which is probably the least nice time to be on the University Park
Yeah.
campus. It is very cold and everything is dead. The university is still beautiful, of course. But when I went, not only, do you drive over the mountains and then Beaver Stadium just appears like
Mhm.
Valhalla, from the valley. That really kind of won me over. But actually, the biggest reason that I fell in love with Penn State is the weekend that I was there was Thon Weekend, which I don't know if you're
Hmm.
familiar with Thon, but it's the largest student-run philanthropy in the world. It's a year-long fundraising effort that culminates in a 46-hour, no sleep, no sitting dance marathon to raise money for research and funding for childhood cancer at Penn State Hershey Children's Hospital. Um, and how do you not fall in love with that? Like the
Yeah.
campus was a ghost town because all of the students were at Bryce Jordan Center dancing for kids with cancer. And I was like, I love that. I want to be a part of that. That is so amazing. And then, of course, you have the prospect of it being not only a D1 football team, but one of the most, prestigious D1 football programs in college football. And Ithaca just didn't have that with their
Yeah.
D3 football program. So just being on that campus, like I'm like, this is college, right? Like on top of all of the opportunities that Penn State provided me, just everything about the campus, the university, the history, the legacy, the colors, I just fell in love with, and I have no regrets. I still bleed blue and white, and couldn't have made a better choice.
Yeah. So once you kind of navigate through school and you're figuring out what you're going to do, and obviously you said, theater was where your heart was and journalism was secondary. When was it that those kind of switched, or did they never switch and you're still a theater kid at heart?
They never really switched. I'm still a theater kid at heart. I've watched Wicked more times than I'm willing to admit, but it was more so just I felt like I could make a bigger difference taking the journalism route, right? Like
Mhm.
it's every industry is competitive, but performing the theater side, like that was a dream, that was a passion, um, but I knew I wasn't as good as a lot of these people that we see, right? Like it was going to be something I didn't know if I really wanted to dedicate my whole education to maybe not ever making it or being successful. And with journalism, it was something that it came really naturally to me. I just was a natural storyteller. I was very just invested in different storylines, and there was just so much opportunity and diversity in skill set. And like I could learn so many things and apply them in so many different ways. And not to age myself, but when I was in college, that was really the start of social media taking over as a news platform. And we're learning these new mediums in real time. And I just saw so much potential in different things that I could do where it made that question of like, oh, what do you want to be when you grow up? Not only impossible to answer, but kind of moot because it was going to change. It was evolving. And who knew, the prospect of being a social media manager didn't even exist when I was in college. And when it did, when I graduated, it was one of those like low paying entry level jobs. And now
Mhm.
it's one of the most important jobs at companies. So I just got excited to be a part of just this revolution of media and meet a lot of really cool people along the way and get to tell stories and still do all of the things I loved with theater, writing and reading scripts and doing my stage makeup and being on camera and figuring out what to wear. There's a lot of crossover.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny to one talk to someone that was in college around the same time that I was, where social media wasn't really a thing. Like I can remember, as a freshman, you had to have a school email to be on Facebook, and being on Twitter, I had to sign up for a class because it was like so new and emerging. And you mentioned it, social media management wasn't a thing. People didn't really know how to utilize this new tool, and not to say that they truly know how to utilize it now, but it is such an emerging way of how we in the sports business cover sports. It is, you have to have a social media plan, you have to have some sort of way to let your community know what happened in the moment immediately. And it's gone from just posting text to now posting videos to even being live on social media. How have you navigated that world and continued to pivot? And I feel like in sports, we have to kind of reinvent ourselves every single day. How have you navigated that world yourself? I know how I've gone about it, but how have you navigated that world yourself?
I mean, I'm still navigating it, right? I'm still learning it. The challenge for me is making it more about myself, right? Like when we're in journalism school, you're you learn to like, be unbiased, and the
Hmm.
subject of your story, like it's all about the protagonist. And now it's so much about personal branding, where it's like if you want people to listen to what you have to say, listen to the stories you have to tell, you have to showcase your authentic self. Now, by saying that, a lot of people chose to not show their authentic self and pretend it's their authentic self, and that's how we have influencers taking over the world in the industry. But there's just this pressure to now, like, no, I have to take pictures of myself and post them. I have to put myself on camera. I'm encouraged to share my opinion and my hot takes on things. And it goes against so much of what we learned in J school, but it's so important now to differentiate yourself from such an oversaturated market of personalities and people to go to. So I've definitely struggled with that, but it's something that I'm slowly learning to embrace. But I think the biggest thing is, as far as like how to successfully navigate it without getting totally drowned out, is just looking at each thing like the newest challenge, the newest thing you have to learn, which is again what made me fall in love with this role, this industry to begin with, is that it is always changing. So, not being complacent, not getting used to one thing, knowing that it's going to change and you got to stay with it or else you might as well leave. Um, it can be exhausting. It can be emotionally and physically draining, but it is a challenge that I have welcomed, and I'm still learning and navigating.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to go kind of back in time to that first job and what were those feelings like? And, obviously, for me, I never thought that I'd have a microphone in front of me. I wanted to be a sports writer, and I was newspapers, magazines, maybe writing blogs. I was not turn on the camera, turn on the light, and let's talk. I'm glad that I've transitioned into that. I feel like it's a little bit more natural for me and a lot of other people that probably went to journalism school around the same time as me, or us, I should say, and just wanted to be writers and didn't want to be on screen or weren't in broadcast. But when you first got that first job, and after it was no longer just practice on the Penn State campus, and now it was big corporation and big companies, and you're thrust into literally the biggest conversations on the national stage. What was that like for you? What were the nerves like? What was the preparation like? Did you ever feel like, you weren't prepared enough when the time came? Or was it, okay, I got this. I've been here plenty of times and I know I can do this.
Well, the funny thing is now what, 12 years into this, you never feel like you're prepared enough, right? No matter how much
Yeah.
prep you do, as soon as that camera rolls, you're like, oh no, what am I asking, right? Because you never know what they're going to say either. But I will never forget the first time I did an on-camera interview. I was not prepared at all. I didn't even know it was going to happen. My first job out of college, I was working for this small sports media startup. It was really like this like content marketing, white label content creation company where we had different clients, whether it
Hmm.
be athletes, leagues, organizations. And I was a social media coordinator. So I was creating content, not with my face on it, but creating graphics, creating memes. That was like the launch of memes. Memes were a
Hmm.
really big deal. And I was writing articles and managing the different social media accounts for these leagues. And we had two of the athletes for a boxing promotion that our company worked with just happened to stop by the office. Like we found out like an hour ahead of time that they were coming. So the CEO of the company is like, well, we should make them feel super special. We should interview them. We should do a roundtable. We should do this. Carissa, you could do it. And I was like, well, 21 years old. I didn't know anything about these two athletes. And it was like this live panel forum in front of the entire company. So I had like 100 people in the office just watching me, sit at the table with these two boxers that came in that I had maybe 20 minutes to do a quick Google search on and learn about. And I was so nervous, like sweating, shaking. And we sit down and they start rolling the camera and the lights are on and everybody's staring at me. And I just had this moment of panic, like, what do I do? And then you just kind of roll with it, right? Like you have to.
Hmm.
You can't you can't just freeze. So I just started talking to them and we end up just having this really natural, great, organic, flowing conversation. And that to very terrifying moment was kind of like the start of me figuring out what my interview style is. It's like, don't get me wrong, I am far more prepared into every interview I go into now. But I realized very quickly that like you could sit down and have a conversation with anybody and not know them. And the whole point of being an interviewer is asking questions to get to know that person. So going in with background is super, super helpful, but having the confidence, the same confidence you would have sitting next to somebody at a bar is like the confidence you need to be on camera. Now, granted, I'm a little bit more concerned about making sure my hair is not sticking up and my makeup's not messed up and, angles. But it was so scary, but at the same time, such a relief that like, oh, I can do this if I'm just myself and approach every interview thinking that this is just a conversation, I'll be fine. I'm terrified every single time before the camera starts rolling, but then as soon as it starts rolling, I'm good now. You just have that little moment. But that was really like from then I continued to do interviews for them, little one-off stuff. And then from there went to Vice where I was hosting on camera Vice Sports Explains, explaining some of the top stories or different technical terms or salary caps or whatever. And I just really enjoyed not necessarily being on camera, but being able to tell those stories and articulate things in a way that would resonate with an audience to where they would find me to be an authentic, verifiable source. So a moment I will never forget, a moment I do not ever want to replicate. And that's how we got here.
Yeah. And now, we talked the other day and you said, it wasn't necessarily your plan to be in combat sports, but that's literally where your career has taken you, right? You've been, PFL and, BYB. There's been a number of different places that all have either a ring or a cage where you're speaking. And as you've kind of allowed your career to develop in front of you and not saying no to opportunity, how have you continued to stay sharp and make sure that, you are prepared for a different community than one that you probably didn't expect yourself to be in?
Yeah, well, it kind of all goes back to that first interview, right? Like I knew I didn't know anything about boxing. I didn't know anything about these two fighters, but I had to learn about them. So every opportunity I've had, because I interviewed those boxers and I worked with WSOF as a client, when I go to Vice, they have a partnership with UFC and they have Fightland. So they're like, oh, Karisa worked in boxing and MMA. She can do a Fightland. And then from there, I go to Sporting News and they are owned by DAZN. Oh, Karisa's covered boxing. So these opportunities kind of fell in my lap. But the reason that, I have a problem saying no. So that's the big thing, right? Like, I'm like, yeah, sure, I can cover MMA and boxing. I don't know what I'm talking about. But I think a really big reason why I've been able to stay sharp and be successful in this space is because I know what I don't know, right? Like I know I am not a fighter. I've taken a few classes here and there, right? But like I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in jujitsu or striking or Muay Thai, anything like that. So when I'm approaching these athletes, I am asking genuine questions. I'm not trying to show off by telling them like all the knowledge I have and then asking them a follow-up question so we can sit there and have a conversation as two experienced fighters, which is what you see a lot in the industry. And I don't hold it against those people. I mean, a lot of reporters in the combat space, they do train and they were amateur fighters or even pro fighters. So I don't hold that against them, but I don't try to be that. So I think it's brought a fresh perspective to this space. And it's really allowed me to connect with fighters because they can see I'm not trying to like compete with their knowledge. I'm not trying to get a gotcha moment. And because I'm asking genuine questions, I'm learning. Like I'm learning in real time their style, their approach. So then when I see them fight and I have the opportunity to do a follow-up interview, I can reference those specific moments that they either told me about or that I saw in action. And it's been able to make the conversations just feel so much more genuine and you get so much more out of it because I'm not assuming that the audience knows what we're talking about because I don't know what we're talking about, right? So I'm asking the same questions that the casual fan might be asking. And it's really benefited me. And I've actually learned a lot about the sport. And sometimes I surprise myself. I'll say something. I'll be like, yeah, I know what a sprawl is, so it's been fun learning and evolving with it.
Yeah. And you mentioned that first interview that was something you were not at all prepared for. Now you are prepared for just about everything that you go into. And obviously, as prepared as we try to be when we're going into an interview, there's always going to be something that you have to pivot, right? But what are some of those highlights? What's an interview that or a project or a coverage that you were super prepared for? Something that you took your time, there wasn't a stone unturned, and you were really excited for, that will always be something that is just like on your highlight reel?
Easily my first interview I ever did with Jon Jones. That was like a very, very last minute ask. I was working at Sporting News at the time with Andreas Hale, who's now MMA reporter for ESPN. And Andreas had done all the on camera interviews. I was a producer, so I wasn't even on camera talent. And he had a conflict and found out, the day before that he had the opportunity to interview Jon Jones via Zoom. And Andreas texts me and he's like, I can't do it. Like, I have this other obligation, but it's Jon Jones. We can't not do an interview with him. Do you want to do it? And I think in that moment, like my heart dropped because I'm like, I have not done a legit on-camera interview in this type of setting, right? Like if I go to boxing fights and stuff, I'm part of the media gang around the athletes, and I'll do the quick like back and forth with the mic, but to just sit down and have a conversation, I felt very rusty. And for him to trust me with it was just a huge compliment of confidence. And I didn't want to let him down or our bosses down. So I pretty much pulled an all-nighter that night because I think I found out at like 6:30 p.m. the night before for an interview with him. I don't even remember what time it was the next day. I was up all night just like watching his interviews, trying to get an idea of his personality. Because at this time, it was right before his debut at heavyweight against Cyril Gahn. So he hadn't been in the ring in like 3 years or something crazy like that. Or cage, I should say. So I get on the call with him, and I had been warned that like, he could be kind of difficult. Like he could be a jerk sometimes. So I was a little nervous. He was so wonderful, and the conversation just flowed so smoothly. I was able to kind of grasp how he was going to be with me early on in the conversation, where I felt comfortable asking him a little bit more difficult questions, like about his checkered past, about, different allegations about him. And he was very gracious in how he answered them. And it was just a really, really great conversation. And I was so nervous going into it, but it felt so easy once we were just talking to each other. And at the end of the interview, when I said thank you, he's like, that was really good. That was a lot of fun. You're good at what you do. And that was like, I'm like, okay, cool. This wasn't just me. Like there was chemistry here, right? We were vibing. So that was definitely a highlight. And from there, I went on to do a lot of interviews then for Sporting News, which then ultimately landed me the job with the PFL, where that's all I did was fighter interviews. And I have since ran into Jon Jones. I had never met him in person before that. I met him in Saudi Arabia last year, and he knew exactly who I was, came up, gave me a hug. I interviewed him again. And it was just this really, cool full circle moment that conversation with him gave me the confidence to go on and do all the things I've been able to do since.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you can be on with an athlete and somebody who you're like, I don't know how he's going to take to me, right? Like that's always part of the game, where you're prepared, you're ready to talk, but you don't know what their personality is going to be on any given day, right? They could have been coming off a really tough training session. Something could have gone wrong before that interview. Their mind could be, could be elsewhere. But when there is that, that chemistry, where it is a back and forth conversation, where it is just seamless, it makes everything so much easier. And, as like I said, when we talked earlier in the week, we talked about how being a woman in the industry, it's not the easiest. And, I mentioned Mina Kimes and how you see how Mina handles people on social media. And, social media, that's the kind of the water cooler of the world right now, where everybody is going to be. Have you gotten pushback? Have you had any sort of contention as you've gone from different places and done different things? How have you kind of navigated that world of being a woman in, pretty predominantly men's sport?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can name 5 women across boxing and MMA and bare knuckle who do what I do, so to say. There's not a lot of us. And it's definitely been a challenge because really with any job, especially in broadcast, women in general, right? You always feel like you have to work harder to prove yourself. But especially in the combat space where it is not only is it a very male dominated sport, but it is a violent sport, right? Like there is it is violent and it is masculine in a whole nother sense. Even with the women fighters, they're terrifying. And I'm more scared of the women than the men because I'm like, you might punch me in the face, like, I don't know. So I think for me, I always felt the pressure of like, I used to be so scared to ask questions during media week. Like when I wasn't working for the promotion, when I was with Sporting News, I covered a lot of Canelo fights, a lot of Anthony Joshua fights, Tyson Fury fights. And when you're in the media scrum surrounded by all of these seasoned, like legacy boxing reporters, I rarely ever asked a question in those environments because I'm like, I don't ever want to sound dumb. I don't ever want anybody to be like, oh, she's like some girl coming in trying to look cool or whatever. But then I would hear them asking the same questions that I was going to ask, right?
Yeah.
So I'm like, damn it, I should have asked. And that was always a huge fear. But, as soon as I was able to get in a room alone with a fighter, I can feel confident in the questions I was going to ask and have a great conversation. So it was always this balance of like putting yourself out there, not being shy, but then not thinking that you're trying or you don't know what you're talking about. And then for me, and it sounds silly, but it is still so true to this day, I get so stressed out over what I wear because it's like you want to dress nicely, right? And look good on camera, but you want to be fashionable and professional. You don't want to be too sexy. You don't want to be too frumpy, right? Like there's this very fine line of where you're dressing to your personality to where you feel confident, but you don't want to look like you're trying too hard. And it's a struggle. Like I really stress out about it because I feel like perception is so important. Not only with the athletes, but just with my peers and other people in the industry or the promoters who are willing to arrange these interviews. First impression is so important. So those are definitely things that I'm willing to bet the men doing this don't stress out as much about. Like, I don't think you're going to an event worrying about what your hair looks like or how your makeup looks, like that's like not a universal problem. So, it's all about that. And then there's just another thing that's just a lot of people don't think about. It's such a social industry too, right? It's so small. Everybody knows each other. There's so many happy hours or events, and we're all hanging out as industry professionals. And when you're the only woman or one of the only women, you have to conduct yourself in a certain way to not look like you're flirting or you're this. And there's just so many things to be conscious of that it's exhausting because nobody else in the room is dealing with that. It has gotten so much better since I started. I will say there's just been a lot more mutual respect, but it's always just an added layer of pressure and consideration in the back of your mind anywhere I go.
Yeah. And I was going to ask about that pressure, right? The pressure to conform to how the media landscape is changing, right? We talked about how when we're going through J school, it's all about the sport. Your opinion, you can write an opinion piece and people want to hear about your perspective because you are kind of, front seat, front row center for literally all the action, but it's always about the athletes. Whereas in today's day and age, a lot of it is about the journalist. A lot of it is about the talking heads and the people that are on camera. And that's why we're seeing more athletes kind of controlling their own media these days as well. But, the narrative in sports is that you are a brand as a sports journalist. And, the Stephen A's of the world have kind of turned sports media on its head, where he is now on camera and he's the main focus and he's the one asking for the $1 million contracts and all these other things that, I'm sure a number of us journalists would love to be able to partake in. But that in and of itself makes the job a little bit harder because, as you said, you have to put yourself out there. And that is something that I struggle with as well, of like, man, I know I said that on the show, but like, I'm not a look at me type of person. I'm not somebody that wants to put out all of these different things and have people criticizing my opinion or something that comes out. But, I want to make sure that I am having my own brand. But on the women's side of things, as you said, it is about being pretty as well, and not just being pretty. As you said, you want to make sure that you sound smart. There's so many other underlying factors, and with other women getting into the influencer part of things, they do kind of lead with the sexy a lot of the times. Have you had any sort of pressure or anything else where you're like, I need to stick to my guns of who I am. These are my morals. I'm not that kind of person. And I'm going to make sure that my brand is something that I'm proud of. Have you had that sort of pressure, and how have you navigated that? And, all of this in the sense of International Women's Day coming this weekend, how have you navigated that sort of pressure as you've gone through your career so far?
I have felt that pressure more times than I'm willing to admit, to the point where it's been numbing at times, right? Because as I said earlier, like I've always felt this pressure to prove myself, to not ask the stupid questions, to be informed, and to be professional. And a lot of people don't want that anymore. They want me to ask, the silly questions. And it's like, so it all started. I remember I was working for the Dolphins. Now, I know this doesn't happen anymore because it's so not PC, but I was working for the Dolphins a long time ago. I don't want to give away my age. But they used to have this like all-star dolphin, I don't know, like, pop Dolphins questions. That's what it was called. And the guys on the production side refused to ask these questions to the players because they were just so cringy. So of course they made the female intern do it. And like there was nothing more demoralizing than walking up to like Cam Wake and Richie Incognito and being like, so who's the MVP on your all-star bikini team? Like I hated it. I hated it. And I was like, I don't want to do this. Like I want to ask real questions. I want to get to know you. I don't want to ask like this is weird. So I knew really early on I did not want to do that anymore. But these influencers, and credit to them, no hate because it's working well. They're literally coming and taking our jobs because they are just doing this really quick, fast, funny, goofy content that people really like. But it just feels very unnatural to me. Sometimes I could do it, like, right? Like I can do videos where I'm, asking people like their favorite song or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
It's not so much that. It's just holding on to my integrity, my brand. My thing has always been, I want to be the same exact person on camera that I am off camera, right? Like it doesn't switch. I am myself. And it's worked for me, right? Like I've kind of found my own niche in that, and then I just try to stay genuine. But there's a lot of pressure, and the mental health side of things is something that I've personally really struggled with, but I've always been very vocal about it because I know if I've struggled with it, there are so many people, including influencers, who are constantly putting themselves out there who must struggle with it, and they struggle in silence. And it's not okay, right? Like going back to that Jon Jones interview, I told you I felt so confident leaving it. I was really proud of myself. I was really excited about the opportunity. The comments started coming in, and majority of the comments on this video were like, wow, that was a great interview. I don't know who this girl is, but she was great. Like, and then they start going into like, wow, she actually asked good questions.
Yeah.
And like, wow, like I'm impressed that she didn't interrupt him. And which I know are like not mean spirited, but I'm like, these are like borderline, maybe a little misogynistic.
Yeah.
And then, because Jon Jones was smiling at me and I smiled back because that's what polite, happy people do, the comments really took a turn where they're like, oh, they're gonna hook up. Ah, she's pregnant with his next kid. Oh, like
Oh, man.
she's gonna be at the UFC fight. And I'm like, what? Like, and I went from being on this high to then reading the comments to where I think it was the next day, like I had a breakdown
Yeah.
because it was this moment where I was like, it does not matter how good I am. It's always going to come back to I'm flirting or I'm trying to get with an athlete or something about my looks. Like, I get criticized over the silliest things with my looks. Like it's so funny because I'm like, did you even listen to the interview or are you just looking at my big forehead the entire time? Like, what are we doing here? Um, to the point where like I was in the office. I know this is a long story and I apologize, but I was in the office the next day and I'm like reading and I got just like so overwhelmed that I just kind of like broke down and started tearing up a bit. And my coworkers were like, "What's wrong?" And of course they're all dudes and I tell them and they were like, "Then you know what? Say something. Like just say something about it." So I did. Went on TikTok and I recorded a video and I basically called out these people about just how pathetic it is that
Mhm.
the things that are being said about me, you would never dare say to a man who had conducted the interview. They wouldn't even be considerations crossing your mind. And it was during International Women's Month, ironically enough. And I was like, this is why women speak out. This is why
Yeah.
we don't feel like there is equity and equality in the industry because of what I'm dealing with that my coworkers aren't. And it's not to play the victim, it's not to complain, it's just kind of raising awareness that like you keyboard warriors aren't recognizing the work that's actually going in and how you're a part of the problem. That pressure still totally exists to this day because that interview again was, 2 years ago at this point. I still get things. I'm learning to brush it off and not take it personally. But there's just always this pressure to just be what the internet wants you to be,
Yeah.
right? Be what the bosses want you to be. And yeah, they're paying your check, but I I'm not I'm not at the point of my career yet where I'm willing to sell my soul for a paycheck. I want to still be myself. And I think I've done a good job with staying true to myself, but it's not easy.
Yeah. Yeah. It is tough, right? Because as as a journalist with morals, where you're not trying to be the shock jock and you're not trying to just say something for clicks and views and everything else, it is tough to grow your brand and your platform, right? It is to do some of those things, right? Like I can remember posting a video myself, and I have never gone through any sort of ridicule, and I have no idea what it would feel like. But when it comes to not selling your soul for certain things, I feel like there's a number of people that go through it, right? And you get down on, oh, there's only this many likes on this video, or there's no comments, or the impressions, right? As journalistic people as we are, we're looking at analytics all the time to see how our content is doing. And you get down on yourself when things don't go as well as you thought, right? So the push to maybe take a harder turn to get more of that attention, but you're like, no, I need to stick by these morals and the integrity that I have, and it's it's always, worse for women in the industry who are pretty and who, they're like, oh, they're barely listening to a word I'm saying. They're just worried about what I'm wearing or anything else like that, right? So, having the morals that you stick to and being in, somebody of integrity, it's always going to be at the top of the list for certain people, whereas others are just, I want to have fun, and there's a camera and a microphone. Let's see how many people will watch us do something stupid. So sticking to those guns is really important. And I noticed right away when we had our conversation the other day that was, you were a person of integrity, and it was why I wanted to have you on the show to speak on that. Um, but also, in that same vein of being somebody that has morals and integrity, and at this point in your career, you are somebody that is a role model. And whether you know it or not, there are young journalists that are certainly looking up to you that are probably in those old journalism schools at Penn State where you're now being used as an example. But before you got to this point, were there any women in the industry that you looked up to, that you looked to and said, that's somebody that I would like to be like, that I want to maybe not be them on camera, but maybe model my style after them?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Mina Kimes, like she's just authentic, and I love that
Mhm.
about her. I've loved Megan Levy in her role, UFC, now on the sidelines, college football. Like she's been someone who I really appreciate her style. Um, the Michelle Tafoyas of the world. And there's definitely been several women that I have looked up to. But to your point, right? There's never been anyone that I've looked at and saying like, I want to be them, because I've always wanted to be me. And that's not saying that like I'm better than them or better than anybody else. I just I would look at the way that they would do interviews and be like, that works for them. That doesn't work for me. Like that's not my style. I've wanted to be different. Um, so there's never been a person where I'm like, yes, I model everything I do after them. I'm inspired by them and I appreciate them and I respect them so much. But I've just always just tried to be different. Now, with that being said, all of those women I just listed are far more successful than I am, right? So maybe they've got it going on. But I'm okay with that, right? I'm okay with that. And it's funny you mentioned the Penn State journalism students. I have been so honored over the past however many years to be invited back to guest lecture classes, go to attend conferences. Every year at the Super Bowl, there's always a ton of Penn State journalism students there that I get to hang out with and meet. And I've got great relationships with so many of them. And it's funny because they'll tell me that, they look up to me or they think this is so cool or whatever. And then I'm like going on their Instagram and they have like way more followers than I do. And I'm like, I'm looking up to you. Like you've got this figured out more than I do. So there's so much that I'm learning actually now from the younger generation of
Mhm.
journalists coming up than I am from the generation ahead of me, because they didn't have to deal with what's happening now, right? Like the expectations. There have been opportunities that I've applied for, I've put my name in the hat for, where I have been passed over, not because of my abilities or talent, but because I didn't have enough Instagram followers. Like, and that's been vocalized to me, right? So, like, that's just a whole nother level that, we have to deal with now in this industry. And the younger generation coming in, they've got the social media figured out. To
Mhm.
them, that's the easy part. It's now building those relationships, networking, and doing the nuts and bolts of the job, but the branding they've got down. So I find myself idolizing a lot of college students now, more so than I did when I first got started.
Yeah. And yeah, it's tough. Like I said, I can remember when social media was a class
Mhm.
for me, and it was something that I was learning how to utilize and, send tweets and all kinds of stuff. Now, you're basically on Twitter more than you're, in a Google Doc some of these days, just trying to figure out what's happening because all the news is breaking and
Yeah.
that's where most of it's going to come from. So this has been a great conversation. As I said, I realized very quickly when we talked the other day that I wanted to have this conversation with you, and especially like I said, with International Women's Month and International Women's Day being on Saturday, which is coincidentally my mother's birthday as well.
Oh,
So,
happy birthday,
so
Mom.
happy birthday to mom, obviously. But I want to end this conversation the same way I end every single one of them. And it's always with a piece of advice, whether it's to your younger self or to younger students that look up to you. Or, maybe it's something that you've learned throughout your career that you now kind of hold near and dear to yourself when you're going into an interview or on camera spot. So what is a piece of advice that you would give to anyone or that you feel somebody should hear?
The biggest piece of advice that I have consistently given is to be a Swiss Army knife. This industry is constantly evolving and it's so competitive, and there's so many people who want to join it. And unfortunately, it makes it very easy to be replaceable. right? So going out of your way to not only learn a bunch of different skills, but learn about the roles of the people around you who make your job happen, right? Like learn about lighting, learn how to operate a camera, of course, learn graphic design, learn sound engineering, learn about what's happening in the operations side of whatever sport that you're in. Learn about the talent management side. Getting to understand how each department, each entity works together will just give you a much broader understanding of how your role then fits into the industry. And not only will it just make you a better journalist, but then when it comes to that time when the industry does evolve and it's like, oh, well, now, you need to become, I know you were this writer, but now you're a multimedia journalist and you need to be recording your own videos. You know how to edit, you know how to set up your camera, you know how to do these things. It sounds silly now because now it's like second nature to be doing this, but
Yeah.
it wasn't when we got our start, right? Like I'm sure a lot of the things that you're doing now are self-taught, and I know they are for me, right? So just being flexible, being versatile, and really not saying no, like say no to certain things, but just take on the challenge. Like even when you graduate, you don't ever stop learning, right? Like every single year is a new class. It's a new semester of new changes in the algorithm and new technology and new storylines and new leagues. Just always be open-minded and ready to learn. And on top of that, get over the fear of rejection because there is a lot of rejection in this industry. Not only getting turned down for interviews or getting turned down for jobs, but it's a very volatile industry. We've seen layoffs happen time and time again where these different publishers or media companies struggle and they do mass layoffs and then they have mass hiring, and it is so cyclical. They don't tell you in college that you're going to get laid off. Like
Yeah.
it's going to happen and it's okay. It's not personal. It's just the industry that we chose to be a part of. And every experience you're going to grow for, you're going to find a little bit more of yourself and you're going to learn how you can be better the next opportunity, and to not let that deter you or scare you. And it's easier said than done, but I think it's really important. Anybody crazy enough to enter this industry knows that.
That is for sure. It is a ever-changing model every single day, and I think that's great advice. Chris, I really appreciate the conversation. I love everything that you spoke on. And I'm eternally a fan of all your work. And I said that I had known of your work before we even met. And seeing you with PFL, I've done some work with them in the past, and like I said, you were on the forefront of a video that I had seen. So it was great to meet you. It was great to have this conversation, and I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story as well as the advice.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was a blast. And thank you for helping share stories like this to help other people navigate this industry. So I appreciate it.
Now, before we go, I do want you to just kind of let people know where can they find you on social media, maybe your website or anything else, and how they can get in contact with you for any sort of jobs or anything that's happening in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So on social, every platform, you can follow me at Karisa Maxwell. That's with a K and one S. And then my website, karisamaxwell.com, spelled the same way. That's where you can find links to my content, my contact form, and different ways that I can be a part of your team. So definitely go check it out. DM me, X me. Is that what we're saying now? Are we Xing each other?
Yeah, I
don't
guess.
know.
Is that what it is then?
I don't know. It sounds weird. Hop in my mentions. I don't know. But yeah, I'd love to connect. And any way I can help out as well, happy to do so.